Hi, I'm Deborah Hickok of Featherstone Personal and Professional Coaching. And today I'm going to talk to you about how to change the relationship that you have with your inner critic. We all know that when our inner critic tends to show up, the typical response is to be usually very annoyed with the inner critic, to wish that it weren't here, to tell it that it ought to just go sit down and take a break, or often to turn away from the inner critic and really wish that it just weren't around at all. So we're going to talk today about the reasons that your inner critic shows up in the way that it does, and then from there talk about a new way of engaging it. It's actually possible to have your relationship with your inner critic move into having a relationship with a constructive critic, or having your inner critic actually be more of an ally. So what do we understand about the inner critic? Well, the first thing that we know is that it's very natural and very typical for most of us when it shows up to not want to deal with it, or to deal with it through a form of resistance by wishing that it wasn't there, being very annoyed that it's come on board at all, or to turn away from it and kind of see if we can not listen to what it has to say and push it away. Well, responding to our inner critic that way is very similar to responding to anyone that way, anyone who has something that they want to say to you. If you can imagine either someone in your life, a friend, a colleague, an employee, a partner, maybe a child in your life, or better yet, if you even imagine someone when you have something to say to them that you feel is important, responding to you in the following way. They either say to you, back off, sit down, be quiet, wish you weren't here, don't like you, you're not helping, or they ignore you and they just pretend that you're not there. For any of us, when that's the kind of response we get, what happens is we might back off just for the moment, but usually we feel even a bigger rise and more energy around the very thing we wanted to say, because we're basically being told that it's not of value and that there is no interest in us saying it. So this is actually the same with the inner critic, that it may seem like you can put it off a bit or turn away from it or tell it to be quiet for a while. But I bet if most of you ask yourselves, have you actually permanently quelled your inner critic by treating it that way? Has the inner critical voice actually gone away in a long-lasting way by either resisting it, being critical back to it, or ignoring it? I think the answer would likely be no. I know that's certainly true for me. So I came across, through many of my professional trainings as a facilitator and a coach, some really wonderful new ways to deal with the inner critic. And this includes not only what I now do with clients, but it also includes my own personal journey with my inner critic and how I have transformed my relationship with it. So the first thing that I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the origins of the inner critic and the fact that it's natural for us to respond to it the way we do. Our inner critic and our resistance to it is a result of a couple of different things. First of all, let's talk about our response to the inner critic. Let's talk about both the biology and the psychology. So we are still built biologically with the fight or flight response, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The fight or flight response is an automatic, actually part of our autonomic nervous system that springs into action when we're in some kind of danger. And for many, many centuries, this was an important biological feature in terms of actual physical threats and physical danger, especially many years ago with our ancestors. They would either be in fight mode if they were in danger, maybe coming up against a predator of some kind, or they knew that they needed to run in order to save themselves and survive. Well, there are certain kinds of groups of people now, depending on what they do for a living, for example, and other kinds of situations where we may actually be in physical danger, and that's a really important biological response. But for most of us, the threat that we feel is more emotional or psychological now, and yet we still have that same automatic reaction from our nervous system. So when our inner critical voice comes online, it's not unusual to fight it, which is to kind of resist it, bump up against it, not be happy that it's shown up, and be kind of just tired of it, even disgusted with it. Or We pretend it's not there, we ignore it, we kind of push it down under the floorboards, and that would be a form of flight from it. So this reaction is not an unusual reaction, it's quite natural. And yet, it's no longer serving us in the same way that it served our ancestors or people that are in imminent danger now in their lives. So let's talk about another way today that we can engage this critical voice when it comes on board. The psychology that is involved with our inner critic and how it has come online is something I'd now like to address in an overview kind of way. When we are young, we are not critical thinkers. It's actually our job to integrate whatever messages we receive. That's what we're supposed to be doing when we're young. And we get messages in a variety of ways. They can be direct messages, or they can be more situations that we then internalize and they become beliefs that we hold. The situation itself can be a form of a message. And it's our job as kids to take in what is happening around us as the truth. And it is the truth for us at that time. And when we take in those messages, they actually become a form of self-protection. Because in order for us to stay in good stead with our tribe, we want to toe the line, get along, and do what we're told. And this can take different forms. But for example, if you learn that the way to not be punished or the way to get your needs met is by diminishing yourself or keeping your opinions to yourself, then you will learn to do that. And you might even integrate a message that was sent, like, how dare you have an opinion, or children are to be seen but not heard, your opinion doesn't belong here. There may be other situations where we get messages about how to avoid punishment, how to stay off the grid, or how to get our needs met. There may actually be some people that get their needs met by being very loud and aggressive, because this is what worked for them. So this inner voice that stays with us through our adulthood comes online when we're young because it's there to support and help us. If I learn, for example, to keep my opinions to myself or to not ask for what I need, because if I did that, it wasn't going to go over very well, then that's a voice that will stay with me into adulthood unless I consciously learn to change it. So one critical voice could be, you are not worthy of this experience, or you are not to express what you want or what you need, because there's an old belief from when we were young that that's not going to go well. Another place that the inner critic comes on board, and this can happen again when we're very young, is to integrate a belief that we shouldn't take any risks, or if we can't do something perfectly, we shouldn't do it at all. As you can imagine, this is a message that can keep us, again, in a good place in our home life, depending on our family culture or the culture of the other adults that we're with that are raising us. That's the way we need to survive and get by day to day, is by perhaps not attempting something unless we believe that we will succeed at it, or to believe when we're told that we really shouldn't do something that might appear too risky. So that's when this voice comes on board. One thing I want to say as a side comment before going any further is that these messages that we get, for the most part, are not ever an indictment of the people who raised us. This is not what this is about. This is not where we want to put our focus or our energy. It is helping us to have an expanded understanding of where the critical voice originated. But everyone is typically doing the best they can, including our parents and the adults who raised us. Everyone is coming out of their own conditioning and their own consciousness, and this is not a talk that is about indicting the people who were doing their very best to raise us. It's simply about the kind of response we had that ends up forming into and giving birth to an inner critical voice back at that time. Don't take risks. Do it perfectly. You're not to have an opinion here. Don't ask for what you need. Things along that line. I'm sure if you all think about it, you can come up with a couple of party lines that your inner critical voice tends to have. I know that I'm very familiar with what mine are. So, we understand that this actually came on board for protective reasons. For example, if you might get punished if you didn't do something perfectly well, or took what was considered an unnecessary risk or something that was seen as too bold, if you were too boisterous when that wasn't something that was appreciated. These are just random examples I'm giving, and I want to invite you all to consider what is yours, knowing it may have been well intended, but the way it landed inside of you was a voice that started telling you to diminish yourself in some way in order to get your needs met or stay off the radar or perhaps avoid some kind of consequence that wouldn't have been comfortable for you. So then what happens? Well, as we mature into a functioning adult, we expand our consciousness, we expand our awareness, and we start to realize that this voice that is telling me not to move forward, or I don't have any business being imperfect, is in my way now. I want to take risks. I see what's going to get me from here to there, and it involves taking risks. In order for me to be happy or peaceful or joyful, I need to make peace with my inner imperfectionist. I need to make peace with being in my humanity, and that means my imperfection. And so we start to understand that this voice that came online when we were so young, while it absolutely had a noble cause and served us back then, it's actually a block to our advancement and our success now. And the idea is not to try to banish this inner voice. This served a very important role in our life. To clench your stomach as a child and have anxiety when something isn't going well, that's a very organically healthy and appropriate response. Something in this situation isn't right, and my body's telling me that, and perhaps I'm going to stay quiet about it right now. As a mature functioning adult, again, as I said, there's a new awareness that comes in. And it's not about wrestling our inner critic to the ground. You know, as so many people like to say, how has that been working for you? I know for years I tried that, and it just simply didn't work. It was really like meeting a fire by bringing more fire in. I would criticize myself for my critical voice coming online, and it just doesn't work. So the idea is to meet your inner critic right where it is. And let's draw a metaphor here to highlight what I'm talking about. As I said in the beginning, I want you to imagine having something really important to say to someone, and it really feels like you have a goal that is in their best interest, and they are really treating you poorly. They don't want to hear what you have to say. They basically send you a message to get lost, either by ignoring you, avoiding you, or being very critical of the fact that you're knocking at their door and wanting to tell them something. Well, what happens if that same person that you've been trying to speak with suddenly stops what they're doing, stops trying to walk away from you, or criticize you very directly, looks you in the eyes, maybe sits down with you or invites you in to have a seat, and asks you what it is that you're wanting, what it is that you're needing in that moment? I think we all know how different that feels. And believe it or not, it's no different when it comes to your inner critic. The issue with the inner critic is that it's sort of frozen in time because it originated during very different circumstances in our life. It's actually up to us to start to engage our inner critic differently in order for the inner critic to change its behavior. Just like if someone that you were constantly chasing around because you really felt you had something important to say to them, something you felt was good for them, finally decided to give you a moment of their time and their full attention. We take a deep breath. We finally feel seen and heard. We're finally getting a moment of their time. And our energy really changes. And typically we relax. We feel more comfortable. And so does the inner critic. So the idea here is to meet your inner critic where it is. And to actually understand, believe it or not, that this voice inside of you is coming from a well-intended place. And that's the pivotal experience here. That's the turning the light on moment about this inner voice, is to understand that, I guess the metaphor I would draw is, it's kind of like a dear old friend, believe it or not, and I'm sure this sounds radical, but if you had a friend from childhood who had your back like nobody's business and stood by you like nobody else, really helped you duck for cover when you needed to and not take risks that could hurt you, and that friend stayed with you into adulthood, but somehow just didn't know that now the way it was protecting you and serving you is complete overkill, way too heavy-handed, and even the methods are a little dated, then you might want to sit down with that person and explain to them, I'm not going to throw you out with the bathwater. I still want to keep you in my life, but your approach is not working. In fact, it's hindering me even more. Kind of like having your absolutely most trusted employee, the one you trust more than any other employees at your entire company, the one who would have your back no matter what. But this person hasn't learned any of the updated systems at the company and really needs some new training in order to support you in a much more savvy way, a much more contemporary way that's going to work for you. It's the same thing here. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing we do is meet the inner critic right where it is. There is a psychologist, a Buddhist psychologist, whom some of you may have heard of. Her name is Tara Brach. And she talks about this in a way that is meeting the voice that comes up with a sort of neutrality. We don't assign a lot of drama to it. It's just a neutral, even-handed kind of meeting the voice where it is. I know she gives an example of fear that comes up. And by the way, that's what the inner critic is about. It's based in being afraid that you're going to do something that may cause you harm, that may be bad for you. So what Tara Brach says is, oh, I see that fear has come into the room. I see that fear is in the space. She doesn't resist it, she doesn't criticize it, and she doesn't ignore it. She names it. She names that it has come online and that it's now here. And with that even-handed energy, there can be a sort of, really a reverence or a respect for the fact that this voice is now coming in. So the first thing we do is meet it where it is, with a lot of understanding that it has a noble intention and is handling itself very inelegantly if it really wants to help you. The second aspect of how we want to engage our inner critic differently is to keep what's really good and release the rest. Inside of almost anything that has an exterior that's not very appealing is often some kind of gold down in the center that we can mine in and pull out from the middle. And honestly, it's the same with our inner critic. It comes across in a very unwieldy way, often feeling dark and dense and like a real pain, frankly. But just like a lot of things that look, again, not very attractive on the outside, if we can get down into the gold at the center, there really is something of value there. Let's think about this with the inner critic. So let's say we washed away the inner critic and we had no critical voice at all ever inside our heads. I think our first response, at least mine, is, woohoo, that would be great. But the fact is, there is something about a critical voice that can be constructive. It can be constructive criticism. So for example, what if at the very center of all that loud critical noise are things like this? What if there is discernment? What if there is a constructively critical way of looking at a situation before you go into it? What if that critical voice helps you get your boundaries in place? What if that critical voice is the one that causes you to do all your due diligence before moving forward, to assess risks in a way that is intelligent and thoughtful before moving ahead with them? That is actually the deep intention of the inner critical voice that started out trying to protect you and keep you out of trouble when you were younger. So the idea here is to meet our critical voice in that way, that we start to let go of, and even, it may sound kooky, but even in some cases, there are processes that I've been taught in some of my professional trainings, and I use them with my clients, where we directly engage the critical voice because it is a real voice. As Carl Jung said, and many others, we're made up of many parts, and they come and develop and they originate during all the developmental phases of our life. And none of them just simply vanish and disappear. It's how we relate to all these parts that can change our life. So the idea is to sometimes, if you're willing to engage in this practice, to engage your critical voice directly and to let it know that while you really appreciate its intention, you'd like to start to have it release some of its methods and let it know what you're really needing. If that feels a little too far out for you, then I would just consider on your own reflecting on this inner voice, considering this inner critical voice in a new way, and remembering that its origins were noble and organic. It's the metaphor, I guess, that comes to mind when I think about releasing what's not working and keeping what's good is, I guess, something as simple as cleaning out your closet or your sock drawer. We all end up having socks that have holes in them, they've worn too thin, they're not keeping our feet warm anymore, or clothes that don't fit, they really aren't working anymore, they don't fit our needs. But we still have to get dressed every day, we still put on clothing, so we clean out the closet, we get rid of the thin, worn out socks, and we keep what we like and what serves us and what works. So the idea here is to do the same with our inner critic, to actually consider it, ask it if it would be a constructive critic to you. When we understand that it has essential goodness, believe it or not, at its center, and that the conditions of your life are not what they used to be when you integrated these messages because that's what you were supposed to integrate, to keep yourself small or not take risks, for example, that this voice that comes in is simply a deeply, deeply ingrained messenger. And the way that we begin to interrupt this pattern is by thanking the messenger for its service and letting it know that we'd really like to relate to it in a new way. And if you think about relationships, any and all relationships, as the psychologist Harriet Lerner talks about, if you change the way you are relating to someone, that whole dynamic changes. So you can begin by treating your inner critical voice more like this. Yeah, I see that you've come on board. I'm about to take a big risk. And it's completely understandable, since you've been with me my whole life, that you would come on board right now and maybe suggest I not do this. But this is going to advance my career, or this is going to bring me more happiness, even if it doesn't work out the way I want. If I just stay here and don't take risks, or if I beat myself up because I didn't do something perfectly, I'll stay stuck forever. So I appreciate you being worried, but the fact is, I want to pull out what's constructive about your voice, maybe help me be discerning and evaluate a situation. Help me take the lessons from my mistakes. Your inner critic can point that out for you, but in a constructive way. And when we change our relationship, and just think about this in any of your own relationships, if one person changes how they meet that other person, how they respond to them, how they receive them, the whole relationship has the opportunity to change. So this is my invitation for you. There are situations where some people work with a professional because there's specific tools that need to be learned and employed over time to have your relationship with your inner critic soften and change in a sustainable way. But I want to invite you to just try the things I've talked about today, to understand that there is something to appreciate about the history of your inner critic and how it's absolutely possible to have it be your ally by meeting it in a new way, believe it or not, with thanks and respect, and then seeing if you can employ what it's really trying to do for you in a new way. I'm Deborah Hickok, and I really appreciate you watching.